Today, as we continue, we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel, which I suppose the book of Daniel is a more common book to us as we study together. Now, we've been spending, before the Hope Awakens seminar began, we were studying the book of Daniel, and actually in a week and a half or so, we'll probably get back to that once the Hope Awakens seminar is over, going chapter by chapter. Today we're going to look at the book of Daniel in just one message. And so it's going to be not detailed as we are doing during our Daniel seminar, but we're going to look at the big concepts of the book of Daniel. And I'm also looking forward to next week and the weeks after that, we will move on to Hosea and some of the books of the Bible that we don't study nearly as often as maybe we should. So we're going to be studying what has been called the minor prophets. And so as we turn to the book of Daniel today, we're going to be looking, and the title is, God is my judge. Now when we look at Daniel, Daniel's ministry lasted for around 70 years, through almost the entirety of the kingdom of Babylon, from 605 thereabouts BC until at least the third year of the reign of Cyrus, king of Persia. And so about 70 years serving in the Babylonian and then in the Persian courts. Now, Daniel means God is my judge. And as we look at the book of Daniel, I believe that we see the name of Daniel resounding as a major theme throughout the entirety of the book of Daniel. In fact, I would say that the book of Daniel shouts triumphantly that God is indeed my judge. Now, tragically, as we look around us today, there are many times when justice is not served. In 1972, a 25-year-old man by the name of Richard Phillips was sentenced to life in prison. The state of Michigan prosecuted him based on the testimony of a friend. There was no other evidence linking him to the murder scene, but the testimony of the friend, who had also served time in jail, was what convicted him for life in prison without parole. The court-appointed attorney that he had said almost nothing. As the jury came back and delivered the sentence, the judge asked if he had anything to say, and his words were, "Not really, Your Honor, except for the fact that I was not guilty. You know, even though I was found guilty, and it's not too much can be done about it right now to correct the injustice already. So all I can do is just, wait until something develops in my favor." Years went by. He got the best and the hardest jobs in prison that he could, hoping that if he saved up a little bit of money, he would be able to pay for a better lawyer. Multiple times the reviews were looked at, but every time it got to the Court of Appeals, it was overturned. There was declared prosecutorial misconduct, but that also was overturned. In 2009, the parole board asked him to simply tell him the truth, and perhaps they would commute his sentence. And he said, "I had nothing in the world to do with the murder. I did not know the man." 2017, it was looked at again. And this time, the accomplice in the murder, who had refused to say who was his partner in the crime, began to speak 40 years after the fact, and stated that it is actually the friend's witness, the friend who had witnessed against Richard Phillips, that had been the primary one in the murder. 2017, there was a new trial. And they said, if you'll just admit guilt, we will acknowledge the time that you have served. And he said, I would rather die in jail than admit to something that I did not do. March of 2018, the Richard Phillips case was dismissed. He had spent 46 years in prison here in Michigan, that it was determined for a crime that he did not commit. It is the longest known wrongful prison sentence in the United States. Now, most of the time, justice serves us well. But tragically, there are times when justice is miscarried. And as I think about the case of Richard Phillips, he, like Daniel, needed a fair judge. But you know, it reminds me of another case that I became aware of this week, and probably you're familiar with as well. Ahmaud Arbery, young black man that was killed over 2 months ago, but there were no arrests. This week, a video was released showing him jogging down the road, an altercation, and then 3 shots being fired, and him dying. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation took it over just this week, and the 2 men are now arrested. Now, I don't know what happened, but I can say that by viewing the video, it doesn't look good. There are too many young African Americans that have been killed simply because they looked suspicious. And I know people that have not been killed, but have been held at gunpoint because they look suspicious. Ahmaud Arbery and many others like him need a fair judge. And the book of Daniel proclaims, God is my judge. Even though justice does not always prevail on this earth, God is the true judge. And the book of Daniel tells us that God is in control, and God's judgment is the solution to the injustices of this world. And I believe that God calls us to stand up against unfairness and injustice in this world, but at the same time we must recognize that there is something more important, and that is what the message of Daniel conveys again and again, that God is my judge. I want to turn to the book of Daniel. Obviously, that's the book that we're looking at. And I want to look in Daniel chapter 1 to begin with, because there are multiple times when God reveals himself as a judge who is in control, even when things around us seem to be falling apart. Daniel 1, verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. When you look at these 2 verses, they're simple verses, but really what they're saying is that Daniel's world was falling apart around him. Daniel's city was taken captive. Daniel's parents, most likely, were killed. The sanctuary, the center of the worship of Daniel's people, of the God of Israel, was ransacked, and the articles of furniture that were regarded as holy and that only the priest would touch, and not even the priest were to touch the Ark of the Covenant, but these other articles of furniture that only the priest would touch, were taken by heathen hands back to Babylon and placed in the temple of the gods of Babylon. Daniel himself was chained and taken back as a prisoner to Babylon. Daniel's name was changed. It was an entire re-education process that Daniel was being subjected to. His name was changed, and he was seeking to be re-educated by the Babylonians in the schools of Babylon. When we look at Daniel in Daniel chapter 1, the first couple verses here, what we see is a young man whose city has been not destroyed yet, but has been attacked and overcome. A temple that has been raided, and a young man whose hopes and dreams have been crushed. Daniel's world had fallen apart before his very eyes. But Daniel, even though Nebuchadnezzar and those in Babylon had tried to erase it from Daniel's mind, Daniel knew the name that his parents had given him. He knew, and every time he thought of that name, he knew God is my judge. My city might be captive. My temple might be ransacked. My parents might be gone. I might be serving in a heathen court in the palace of Babylon, but God is my judge. And Daniel knew that because God was his judge, God inevitably was still in control. We see this playing out in Daniel chapter 1. It doesn't mention about judgment here, but we see when a judgment took place of Daniel and his friends that God was working in their behalf. Notice Daniel chapter 1 verse 9. Daniel 1 verse 9, now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. God had brought Daniel into favor. Why had God brought Daniel into favor? Because God was Daniel's judge, and God knew that Daniel had done no wrong. We find later on that in verse 17 of Daniel chapter 1, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. God is blessing Daniel in spite of the fact that Daniel's world has fallen in around him. And God is not only blessing Daniel, God is vindicating his name through Daniel during this time when everything looks like it is in shambles. Notice verse 20. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. God was demonstrating that he was working still, even in an unjust, unfair world. Does God still work in an unjust, unfair world that we live in today? God is still at work. God is still upon his throne, and God is still the judge, even in an unfair, unjust world. There are many times that it seems like our world falls apart around us. Daniel was there. Daniel's world fell apart around him, but God was still his judge. There are many times that we do not understand why things have happened the way that they do. Sometimes it seems like one injustice after another takes place, and God does not condone the injustice, but he still works in the midst of an unjust, unfair world. And because God is our judge, we can still trust him, no matter what happens around us. But I want to continue on to Daniel chapter 2. We're not going to look at every chapter here in the book of Daniel. I just want to pick out a couple highlights to show how Daniel's name really is the theme of the book of Daniel. Because not only is God in control when our everything seems to fall apart in our personal lives, God is in control when the world as a whole seems to fall apart around us as well. And I suppose as we look at it today, perhaps it might never have seemed like, at least in our memory, that the world has fallen apart as much as it is right now. With the coronavirus cases at nearly 4 million worldwide, with approaching 275,000 deaths worldwide, and a fourth to a third of those in the United States, there's virtually no place on the world that has not been touched. Economies are paused, governments are bailing out in astronomical figures. It seems perhaps like never before that the world as a whole is falling apart around us. But I imagine to Daniel it seemed like the world was falling apart around him as well. Daniel lived in a time of major upheavals. The major kingdoms that had dominated and had vied back and forth for control, Assyria and Egypt, had waned, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire had come on the stage. And then in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel begins his job. And as he begins his job, one of the first things that happens is he is delivered a, quote, pink slip by an executioner. A lot worse than a regular pink slip. And the executioner comes knocking on Daniel's door. It seems like everything is in upheaval to Daniel and to the world around him. But God was revealing to Daniel, to Nebuchadnezzar, and whoever was willing to listen and look, that God was still in control, even in the crazy world in which Daniel was living. And I want to notice Daniel chapter 2, verses 20 and 21. Daniel chapter 2, verses 20 and 21. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God, forever and ever. For wisdom and might are His, and He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding." This is Daniel's prayer after God has revealed the vision to Nebuchadnezzar that he gave, the dream that he had given to Nebuchadnezzar. And as Daniel prays, the first thing he does in this crazy mixed up world that he lives in is he says, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever." Do you suppose that gave him confidence in the crazy world that he was living in? Do you suppose we could learn from the book of Daniel here and from Daniel's experience as we live in a crazy mixed up world as well, that our attitude, our strength must be, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever." And notice what it says here when we look at it. It says He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with Him. God, even in the crazy mixed up world of Daniel's time, was still on His throne. Aren't you thankful about that? God was still overarching. He was still the judge. God is working still, even not just when our personal lives seem to be falling apart, but when the world around us seems to be falling apart as well. The world can seem like it's a mess today. I don't think it just seems like it's a mess. There's challenges and difficulties everywhere. But this passage in Daniel and the message that God is speaking through it is God is still in control. I'm not saying He directs everything that happens. He's not condoning the problems and the issues, but God is still in control. He raises up kings and puts them down. That's something we need to remember as well. Whether we like or dislike the president or the governor or anybody in between, God is still in control. We don't have to worry about it. It's not our battle. As Daniel proclaims, God is our judge. God is the one. And ultimately, God is still on his throne. And God reveals this to Nebuchadnezzar as well. Notice verse 47 of Daniel chapter 2. Verse 47 of Daniel chapter 2. The king answered Daniel and said, "Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you would reveal this secret." Nebuchadnezzar says, your God is a God of gods. Your God is higher. He is above everything. He didn't recognize perhaps that God was his judge yet, although he was going to be recognizing that very soon in the next chapters. In chapters 3 and 4, we see that God exercises his judgment on Nebuchadnezzar and on Babylon in chapter 5. But I want to continue to Daniel chapter 7, because there's an aspect that I want to look at here that I believe is very important for us as we think about God being our judge and God still being on the throne. In Daniel chapter 7, we see a picture of the enemies of God's people seeming to triumph. We find one beast after another, and we're not looking at this in detail. We've done it before. We'll do it again another time. But we see a lion beast and a bear and a leopard and a dreadful and terrible beast. And then we see a little horn that comes and is persecuting God's people. Notice verse 25 of Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, and shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law, and the saint shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. Notice Daniel is seeing a view of this persecution of God's people. The enemies of God and his people were attacking God and his people. But Daniel sees what God's solution is. And he sees the evidence that God is still ultimately in control. Notice verses 9 and 10 of Daniel chapter 7. Daniel 7, 9 and 10. I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Daniel sees views of the injustice and the problems of this world as ferocious beasts attacking one after another, as one kingdom and then another kingdom and then another kingdom, and they're making an assault and attack upon the people of God. But then he sees something much higher, something much more important going on. He sees in the heavenly realm, he sees Jesus coming before the Ancient of Days, as it says here, and the court being seated, the books being opened. Daniel sees a judgment that makes right the wrongs of this world. There are some things that will never get made right in this world. We have to recognize we live in an unfair and unjust world. We live in a world that has been taken hostage by the enemy of God, by the arch rebel Lucifer or Satan. And because of that, we have an injustice and inequity that abounds. But God has a solution. God is the judge. And Daniel sees this throne. He sees the angels gathered around, looking before as the judgment begins. Notice verse 26 and 27 of Daniel chapter 7. Daniel 7, 26 and 27. But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. He sees this persecuting power attacking God's people. And then he sees the court being seated and his dominion being taken away. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven is given to the people of God. What I want to notice here is that God is our judge, but not only is God our judge, God's judgment is good news. Too many times we're afraid of judgment. Too many times we look with uncertainty and apprehension at God's judgment. That is not how the judgment is presented here in the Bible. Now, if you're guilty, that's a problem. That's why we look at it with apprehension. But my friends, because God is just and He is a fair judge, God's judgment is good news. God's judgment here rescues and delivers His people. It overthrows the persecutors of God's people. God in His judgment does everything He possibly can to exonerate His people. God is our judge. The challenge comes in that we know that we're guilty, that Jesus has taken our guilt. And not only is He our judge, but He is our defense attorney. And God is seeking to pronounce us not guilty if we will only surrender our lives to Him. As we surrender our lives to Him, as we allow Him to transform and to change us, the judgment is good news. It delivers God's people from the injustice and the wrongs of this world, and God's judgment delivers the kingdom, the everlasting kingdom, to God's people. Notice Daniel chapter 8, moving on quickly here. Daniel chapter 8. And once again we see that God's judgment is good news. Daniel 7, we see that through the judgment, God overturns the enemies of His people. In Daniel chapter 8, we see that through the judgment, God restores His true worship. Notice Daniel chapter 8, verse 11. We see a little horn power once again that is attacking God's people. Notice what it says. Daniel 8, verse 11. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. God's sanctuary is attacked. Remember Daniel chapter 1, God's sanctuary, literal sanctuary in Jerusalem, was attacked. Daniel chapter 8, God's sanctuary is attacked here as well. And then verse 12. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. And he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Is there a time when error prospers? That's what it says right here. That truth was cast down to the ground and that it was prospering. God's sanctuary, which I believe He's directing us here to a sanctuary in heaven in which Jesus is ministering at the right hand of God as our great high priest. And He sees an attack on the sanctuary of God. He sees an attack on the truth of God. And He sees it prospering. Does error prosper today? We can see that it does. But God has a plan. God has a solution. What is His solution? Verse 13 of Daniel chapter 8. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation and the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? Sometimes we get mixed up or we get confused in all the details here, and there are a lot of details. But notice what the main question is. The main question is, How long is air going to continue to rain? How long will this attack against God's people and against His worship and against the sanctuary of God in heaven, how long will this continue? Have you ever wondered that before? How long, O Lord, can the injustice, the pain of this world go on? And that's the question that's being asked. And we don't even see a drop of the pain and suffering in this world. Yes, we see some. We see the people dying around us. And that's painful and that's hard. But God sees every single one all around the world. He sees the abuse. He sees the suffering. He sees the pain that they're all enduring. And it hurts His great heart of love more than we can even imagine. Not only do we ask how long, but God asks how long. God knows. I'm not saying He doesn't. But God is wanting to bring an end to the problems, the pain, the suffering, the injustice, all of these things of this world. But notice His solution again in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. And He said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. When we look at this, the sanctuary is cleansed through judgment. And once again, we see God's judgment being the answer to the problems and the pain of this world. The question is asked, how long is evil and suffering? How long is it going to continue? How long is God's truth going to be cast down? How long is God's worship going to be cast down? How long until God's people are going to be set free? And God's answer is, the judgment is His solution. The judgment sets His people free. The judgment reestablishes the worship of our great God. The judgment is good news. And Daniel, as he remembered that name given to him as a boy, attempted to be changed by Nebuchadnezzar to Belteshazzar. But Daniel still retained, my name is Daniel. God is my judge. God is still in control. And as God is still in control, I may not understand what's taking place in my life. I may not understand what is transpiring in the world around me. I may not understand when everything seems to be turned upside down. I may not understand when the righteous suffer and the wicked go free. I may not understand the injustice, the pain, and the problems. But one thing I know, God is my judge, and He's a true and a just judge. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12. And notice what we see here again. In this fascinating prophecy that delineates from Daniel's time essentially until our time still today, to the future still. Notice in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, notice what we find as we see what God does once again. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Once again, we have a judgment scene. We have the book and the names that are written there in the books. You remember in Daniel 7, the books were opened. Once again, we see the same scenario. And again, it is God's solution. He says that the great prince, I believe that's Jesus, the great prince, the chief of princes, the prince of princes. God hath exalted, says in Acts chapter 5, verse 31, to be a prince and a savior, for to give repentance to Israel. It says it exalts Him to be a prince and a savior. And it says He stands up, and there's a time of trouble. There's a time of chaos and trouble coming. even more than today. But Michael stands up, and what is the result here? Notice what it says. And at that time, your people shall be delivered. The deliverance of God's people is the result of the judgment and God standing up in defense of His people. Once again, the judgment is good news. Jesus is our judge. And Daniel's name proclaimed throughout 70 years in Babylon and a few years in the Persian court as well. God, the God of the Hebrews, the God of Israel, the God of heaven, He is the judge. And it was demonstrated. Nebuchadnezzar tried to set himself up, and God said, no, I'm the judge. Belshazzar exalts himself, and God says, no, I'm the judge. The co-workers of Daniel try to get him thrown into a den of lions, and God stands up and says, no, I'm the judge. And then the prophecies reveal that they climax in God delivering His people through the judgment. God is still on His throne. God is still working. And I believe we must trust Him more fully as our judge, the one that sits upon His throne. It's easy to worry when life seems to fall apart around us. It's easy to worry when our nation and the world seems to fall apart around us. It's easy to worry when God's people and His truth are attacked and evil seems to triumph. It's easy to worry when we see injustice and pain in this world. But the book of Daniel proclaims there's a God in heaven. There's a God in heaven who knows secrets. There's a God in heaven who changes kings and changes things up and down. He's in control. And Daniel shouts throughout his 70 years of ministry there in Babylon, God is my judge. I can trust Him. And God works through His judgment to deliver His people. I am so thankful that God is our judge, aren't you? In this world, things don't always go the way we want them to. When everything seems to spin out of control, God is still on His throne. When injustice abounds, God is still on His throne. But God will resolve the injustices of this world through His great and final judgment day. Even sometimes today, God reveals that He's still in control. Remember I said we began by talking about Richard Phillips, longest known wrongful imprisonment in the United States, 46 years in prison. Went into prison when he was 25, came out when he was 71. Has the world changed much from, I think it was 1971 when he went in? Imagine coming out into the world now. But as he came out, he determined to live life. In prison, to deal with the loneliness and the pain, he had taken to art. First poetry, song, and then painting. And he began to paint, and watercolors were sent to him. And he bought watercolors, one or the other. And he sent them to a friend. After he got out, he reconnected. And now he has an art gallery in Detroit from the very paintings that he did while he was in prison. When he went into prison, his son was 2 years old. He's now been able to reconnect, even though his son is 50 years old. Sometimes we get to see wrongs that can never be fully replaced, but wrongs still righted to a certain degree, even in this earth. But in the ultimate reality, God is the judge. and the wrongs of this world are going to be righted. When the world seems to be spinning out of control, God has a plan. Sometimes we have no solution, but God does. I was interested to read several years ago, there was a pilot that was flying from the U.S. to Australia. He was flying in this Cirrus SR-22. Now, it's a small plane, and as it's a small plane, you don't normally fly from the U.S. to Australia. It can only fly maximum of about 5 hours. But this plane was being delivered to a client in Australia, and so it was rigged up with extra fuel. And in order to be able to make it to Hawaii, and as he was flying, somewhere in the flight, he realized that the fuel valves for the extra tanks of fuel that were there in the cockpit was not working. He did not have enough fuel to make it to Hawaii. He was in communication with problem solvers, whoever they were, trying to figure out what could be done. And finally, there was nothing that they realized that nothing could be done. And so they came to another solution. He flew close to a cruise ship. And what I didn't mention about this airplane is it is one of the few airplanes that actually has not just an individual parachute, but a parachute for the entire airplane itself. And so as he flew as close as he could, the cruise ship was alerted of what was taking place, and he got close to the cruise ship, and he pulled the red lever that fired in some way, shape, or form the parachute, and the plane glided down into the Pacific Ocean. And the little boat connected with the cruise ship was able to go and to pick him up. The manufacturers say that it has saved around a couple hundred lives, the deployment of this parachute in this plane. But as I read about that, and as I thought about that, it can seem to us today like our world is in a nosedive down. It can seem like we're spinning out of control and there's nothing that can be done. And sometimes our life can seem like that as well. But God has a parachute plan, if you will. God is still in control. And behind the scenes, He's working still. Because as Daniel proclaims, God is my judge. And the fact that God is my judge and the judgment is going on now is good news. Because through the judgment and through Jesus being our judge, God wants to deliver us from the injustice, the pain, the suffering of this world. And as we realize, as we recognize that God is our judge, may we trust our lives to Him in a fuller way. In the chaotic world that we live in, we might not know what's going to happen next, but God is our judge. We know that for sure. And God is still in control. And no matter what happens in this world, if we've committed our lives to Him and we are trusting in Him, we can rest assured that He's on His throne and He will work His purpose and His will through us, just as He did Daniel. Let us trust Him. Let us remember He is our judge. Let us pray together. Father in heaven, we thank You that You are not only Daniel's judge, but that You are our judge. And that as we commit our lives to You, we have no need to fear. We thank You for the good news of the judgment, that You deliver Your people through the judgment, that You deliver and restore Your worship, and that You will inevitably deliver Your people through Your judgment as well. And Lord, we pray that you will help us to trust you. Help us to rely upon you. No matter how crazy it seems around us, may we trust in you. And we thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.